What was life like before the civil rights movement? The civil rights movement was a struggle for social justice that took place mainly during the 1950s and 1960s for blacks to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. The Civil War had officially abolished slavery, but it didn't end discrimination against the blacks. In fact, black people had to sit in the black. They couldn't drink in the same fountain. There were separate fountains for the blacks. Restaurants had no rooms for black people. There were separate restaurants for colored and whites. The Ku Klux Klan dedicated itself to an underground campaign of violence against Republican leaders and voters, both black and white, in an effort to restore white supremacy in the South. Colored people could have only poor housing, and they couldn't live in the neighborhoods where the whites live. Even justice used different treatment when dealing with the black people. Segregation can be about separating African Americans from whites or about separating Hispanics from whites. Before 1950s, segregation was common and normal in the USA. Segregation deprived minorities of their rights. There are two kinds of segregation. The segregation by law. Laws forbid African Americans from attending the same church, using the same swimming pool, eating in restaurants, or marrying white people. And it was common in the South. Segregation without law was common in the North. Housing discrimination, for example. White community groups did not allow non-whites to live in white neighborhoods. Every ethnic group had its own part of town. Thanks to Martin Luther King, the nonviolent civil disobedience made the civil rights protesters look like good people and made their opponents look hateful, violent, and angry. The NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is a civil rights organization in the United States formed at the beginning of the 20th century as a biracial organization to advance justice for African Americans. Among its leaders, I can mention Marshall. He was a lawyer, and his cases involved school segregation. Rosa Parks, who refuses to give up her seat on a bus to a white man, and as a result, the Montgomery bus boycott occurs. And finally, Dr. Martin Luther King, who gains national prominence as a leader during the Montgomery bus boycott, and he was arrested in Birmingham. Civil rights leaders used non-violent protests, civil disobedience, and legal action to change the U.S. As a non-violent protest, they use boycotts, such as refusing to buy goods or services from a business in order to force it to change its policies, or hunger strikes, refusing to eat anything in order to get attention for your cause, petitions, writing a letter to ask the government or a company to change its policy and then getting as many people to sign it as possible, marches and demonstrations, getting as many people as possible to gather in one place to get attention to your cause, and finally strikes, refusing to work in order to force your managers and government to change your policies. As for civil disobedience, they wanted to break the law or causing a disturbance in order to get attention for your cause. Sit-ins, for example. The protesters come into a place, sit down, and refuse to move. Legal actions, when lawyers can challenge a law or policy in a court. People can try to convince legislators to make new laws or repeal unfair ones. And now, As you watch the next part of the presentation, try to classify each action taken by the people in the civil rights movement. Let's start with Linda Brown. In 1951, a girl named Linda Brown wanted to go to school. The white school was very close by, but the African American school was far away. Her parents sued the Board of Education to try to force them to allow Linda to attend the white school. In 1954, in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, the Chief Justice said that segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. He ordered all the schools to end segregation. The second example is Rosa Parks. In Alabama, the bus company had a rule that said all African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus. But in 1955, Rosa Parks, an African American woman, sat down in the front because all the seats in the back were full. When the bus driver ordered her to move, she refused. He called the police and they arrested her. Martin Luther King told the African American to stop riding the bus. For months, the bus company was losing a lot of money because most of the passengers were African Americans. Eventually, they were forced to change a rule. Then, in 1956, the Supreme Court declared segregation on public transportation unconstitutional. Another example is the college students in Greensboro. In 1960, many restaurants would not serve African Americans. To protest this, some African American college students decided to go to a lunch counter and order food. The servers refused to serve them, but the students refused to leave. These lunch counter protests spread throughout the USA. Many white students came along to support African Americans. And finally, the March on Washington, D.C. on August 29 and 28, 1963. The March on Washington was a massive protest march that occurred in August 1963, when some 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Also known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the event aimed to draw attention to continuing challenges and inequalities faced by African Americans a century after emancipation. It was also the occasion for Martin Luther King's now iconic I Have a Dream speech. What was the result? At short term, they continued the violence. There were murders and assassinations. But, at least, in the long terms, the March on Washington results in civil rights actions of 1964. In fact, the rising tide of civil rights agitation greatly influenced national opinion and resulted in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, guaranteeing equal voting rights, outlawing discrimination in restaurants, theaters, and other public accommodations, and finally encouraging school desegregation.